The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Cities lay in ruins. Military records were being gathered. Officers who had spent years fighting across the Pacific were finally looking back at the conflict that had changed their lives forever. Among the many names discussed in post-war interviews, intelligence reports, and military evaluations, one American commander kept appearing again and again. He was not as famous as some battlefield generals. He did not command massive armies charging across Europe. Yet Japanese commanders spoke about him with a mixture of frustration, respect, and disbelief. His name was General George C. Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. And according to many Japanese officers, he fought a war unlike anything they had expected. Long before victory was certain, Japanese commanders had learned to respect American industrial power. They understood that the United States could build huge numbers of aircraft, ships, and tanks. But numbers alone did not explain what happened in the skies over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the vast waters of the Southwest Pacific. Something else was happening. Something that seemed to break the traditional rules of air combat that many military leaders had accepted before the war. Years later, Japanese officers would remember attacks that appeared impossible, aircraft operating from places they never expected, and tactics that seemed reckless until they worked with devastating effect. Again and again, reports reached headquarters describing American air operations that did not fit conventional doctrine. And behind many of those reports stood one man who constantly asked a dangerous question. What if the accepted rules were wrong? To understand why Japanese commanders talked about Kenney after the war, you have to go back to the dark days of 1942. At that moment, the Pacific War looked very. Japan had conquered enormous territory. Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and much of the Pacific. Their military appeared unstoppable. American and Allied forces were struggling to slow the advance. Morale was low. Equipment was scarce. Bases were vulnerable. The future seemed uncertain. In July 1942, Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of Allied air forces under General Douglas MacArthur. The situation he inherited was difficult. Aircraft were worn out. Pilots were exhausted. Supplies were limited. The Japanese held important positions throughout New Guinea and threatened Australia itself. Many commanders might have focused on survival. Kenney immediately focused on change. From the beginning, he showed little interest in doing things simply because they had always been done that way. Traditional air doctrine often separated fighters, bombers, and attack aircraft into specific roles. Missions were planned according to established theories. Kenney respected experience, but he believed battlefield reality mattered more than text. Japanese intelligence officers soon noticed something unusual. Allied aircraft were appearing more aggressively than before. Attacks were becoming less predictable. Instead of following patterns that experienced Japanese commanders understood, American air operations began creating new problems. Kenney encouraged experimentation. He listened to mechanics, pilots, and squadron leaders. If someone had an idea that might improve combat effectiveness, he wanted to hear it. This approach was rare in many military organizations where rank often mattered more than innovation. One of the earliest examples involved aircraft modifications. Standard doctrine said aircraft should be used according to their intended design. Kenney, if an airplane could be made more effective for a specific mission, he wanted it modified. In workshops across Australia and New Guinea, mechanics began transforming aircraft. Guns were added, weight was reduced, attack capabilities increased. Some of these changes would have horrified peacetime planners. Yet they produced results. Japanese commanders started receiving reports about American aircraft conducting unusually aggressive low-level attacks. These attacks often appeared where they were least expected. Ships, supply dumps, and airfields suddenly became vulnerable in ways that Japanese planners had not anticipated. At first, some Japanese officers believed these incidents were isolated. War often produced strange events, but the pattern continued. As 1942 progressed, Kenney emphasized a simple principle: destroy the enemy's ability to fight before he reaches the battlefield. That idea sounds obvious today. At the time, carrying it out across the vast distances of the Pacific required extraordinary effort. Japanese forces depended heavily on supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Troops needed food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. If those supplies could be interrupted, entire operations could be weakened. Kenney turned Allied air power into a weapon aimed directly at those supply lines. Japanese commanders increasingly found themselves fighting not only against enemy troops, but also against shortages. Convoys faced growing danger. Airfields came under repeated attack. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. What frustrated Japanese officers was not merely the damage, it was the unpredictability. Traditional doctrine often assumed certain limitations. Aircraft had expected ranges. Attacks followed recognizable patterns. Operational decisions were constrained by accepted military thinking. Kenney constantly searched for ways around those limitations. By late 1942, Japanese commanders were discovering that assumptions they considered reliable were becoming dangerous. Then came one of the most important chapters of the Pacific Air War. The setting was New Guinea. The Japanese High Command understood the strategic importance of the region. Control of New Guinea affected supply routes, future offensives, and the security of positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. Maintaining forces there required constant reinforcement. In early 1943, Japanese planners organized a major convoy operation. Thousands of troops were to be transported to reinforce Japanese positions. The mission was vital. Success would strengthen Japanese defenses. Failure would have serious consequences. Japanese commanders believed they had planned carefully. Escorts were assigned. Air cover was arranged. The convoy would move through dangerous waters, but military leaders felt the operation could succeed. What happened next became one of the most studied air battles of the war. The date was March 1943. The location was the Bismarck Sea. As Japanese transports moved toward their destination, Allied reconnaissance aircraft tracked them. Information flowed to commanders. Preparations began. Kenney and his staff had spent months developing new approaches to attacking ships. Traditional bombing methods often faced serious limitations. High-altitude bombing against moving ships was difficult. Accuracy could be poor. Valuable opportunities might be wasted. Kenney supported techniques that placed aircraft dangerously close to their targets. The risks were enormous. Pilots would face anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft could be hit. Casualties could be severe. Yet the potential rewards were equally significant. Allied crews practiced low-level attack methods. They refined tactics. They trained repeatedly. Many Japanese commanders had never encountered attacks executed in quite this way. When the battle began, confusion spread rapidly through Japanese formations. Aircraft approached at low altitude. Bombs skipped across the water toward ships. Strafing attacks swept across decks. Multiple waves struck from different directions. Japanese sailors and soldiers found themselves under relentless assault. For many Japanese officers, the battle seemed to unfold with shocking speed. Defenses that looked adequate during planning proved insufficient under actual combat conditions. The results were devastating. Transport ships were sunk, troops were lost, supplies disappeared beneath the sea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a disaster for Japan. Afterward, Japanese commanders conducted analyses trying to understand exactly what had happened. Again and again, reports pointed toward Allied tactical innovation. The attacks had not merely relied on superior numbers, they had exploited weaknesses in existing assumptions. Techniques that many traditional planners viewed as excessively risky had achieved remarkable effectiveness. Years later, some Japanese officers would identify the battle as evidence that Allied air power, particularly under Kenney's leadership, had entered a new phase. But Kenney was not finished. What made him particularly difficult to counter was his refusal to remain predictable. Military organizations often develop successful tactics and then repeat them. The problem is that enemies adapt. Once a pattern becomes visible, defenses can be improved. Kenney understood this danger. Whenever possible, he changed methods. He adjusted operational priorities. He encouraged flexibility. Japanese commanders attempting to anticipate Allied actions faced a frustrating challenge. By the time they developed responses to one problem, another often appeared. This adaptability became especially important in New Guinea. The terrain itself seemed designed to defeat military planners. Mountains rose sharply from dense jungle. Weather changed rapidly. Supply routes were difficult. Airfields required enormous effort to build and maintain. Yet Kenney saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. He pushed aircraft closer to the front whenever possible. Forward airfields reduced response times. Missions could be launched faster. Pressure on Japanese forces increased. To Japanese commanders, it often felt as though Allied aircraft appeared everywhere. An airfield thought secure would be attacked. A convoy believed hidden would be discovered. A reinforcement effort carefully organized would encounter unexpected resistance. Part of this success came from intelligence, reconnaissance, and cooperation among Allied forces. But another part came from Kenney's determination to maintain initiative. He believed the enemy should constantly react rather than act. This philosophy produced a relentless operational tempo. Japanese officers repeatedly found themselves responding to Allied moves instead of executing their own plans. As the war continued, shortages became increasingly severe. Fuel became harder to replace. Aircraft losses became more difficult to recover. Experienced pilots disappeared. Meanwhile, Allied strength continued growing. Yet many Japanese commanders later acknowledged that resources alone did not explain the situation. Several noted the effectiveness with which Allied air power was employed. Kenney's command emphasized practical results. He cared about destroying enemy capabilities. If achieving that objective required unusual tactics, he was willing to consider them. This attitude occasionally created tension even within Allied circles. Some officers preferred more conventional approaches. Certain ideas appeared too risky. Others challenged established doctrine. But wartime success has a way of changing opinions. Operations that initially seemed controversial produced measurable results. Japanese commanders witnessed those results firsthand. Airfields became targets of constant pressure. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed. Supply networks suffered repeated disruption. Perhaps most importantly, Japanese forces increasingly lost freedom of movement. Moving troops during daylight became dangerous. Shipping operations faced growing risks. Large concentrations of forces attracted attention. These limitations gradually affected strategic decision-making. Military power depends not only on weapons but also on options. The fewer options available, the harder victory becomes. Kenney's air campaign steadily reduced Japanese options. Post-war assessments from Japanese officers often reflected this reality. Many recognized that Allied control of the air transformed the battlefield. Yet, they also noted that control had not appeared automatically. It had been built through aggressive operations, innovation, and continuous pressure. One Japanese commander reportedly described Allied air activity in New Guinea as an ever-present threat that made planning increasingly difficult. Another observed that American air attacks often seemed to arrive before defenses could fully prepare. Such comments reveal an important truth. By the later stages of the war, Kenney had accomplished more than tactical victories. He had influenced enemy psychology. Japanese commanders could never be entirely certain where the next attack would occur. That uncertainty carried consequences. Planning became more complicated. Resources had to be dispersed. Defensive measures expanded. Every precaution consumed time, and the psychological effect multiplied the physical damage. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, Kenney continued supporting operations through air superiority, interdiction, and logistical disruption. His aircraft struck shipping, airfields, troop concentrations, and supply routes. Japanese commanders faced an increasingly difficult situation. Every lost ship reduced mobility. Every destroyed aircraft weakened defense. Every interrupted supply line created new problems. Yet despite these successes, Kenney rarely fit the popular image of a dramatic battlefield hero. He was not leading infantry assaults. He was not standing on the front line with a rifle. His battlefield existed across maps, airfields, maintenance depots, briefing rooms, and operational headquarters. That made his achievements easier to overlook for casual observers. Japanese commanders, however, could not overlook them. They experienced the consequences directly. When they studied Allied operations, they repeatedly encountered evidence of an air commander willing to challenge assumptions, a commander who encouraged innovation, a commander who focused on practical effectiveness rather than a commander who understood that the greatest advantage often comes from doing what the enemy does not expect. After the war, as military historians examined Pacific campaigns, Kenney's reputation continued growing. His methods influenced future air power thinking. Many techniques refined during the Southwest Pacific Campaign became important examples for later generations. The lessons extended beyond aircraft. They demonstrated the value of adaptability. They showed how innovation can overcome difficult circumstances. They proved that established doctrine should be questioned when reality demands it. For Japanese commanders reflecting on the war, these lessons were impossible to ignore. They had entered the conflict facing opponents they often underestimated. Over time, they encountered commanders who adapted faster, learned continuously, and exploited opportunities aggressively. Among those commanders, George Kenney stood out. What exactly did Japanese commanders say after the war? The wording varied from officer to officer. Some emphasized Allied innovation. Others highlighted the effectiveness of air attacks against shipping. Still, others discussed the growing difficulty of operating under constant aerial pressure. But a common theme appeared repeatedly. Respect, not admiration for an enemy's cause. Not approval of Allied objectives. Respect for military effectiveness. Respect for a commander who consistently found new ways to create problems. Respect for an opponent who refused to follow predictable patterns. Respect for a strategist who understood that winning often requires abandoning comfortable assumptions. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. George Kenney did not become influential because he possessed unlimited resources from the beginning. He arrived during a period of uncertainty. He inherited serious challenges. He faced an experienced enemy controlling large areas of territory. Instead of accepting limitations, he looked for possibilities. Instead of protecting tradition, he pursued results. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, he adapted to imperfect ones. That approach gradually transformed Allied air operations in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese commanders noticed. They noticed when convoys disappeared. They noticed when airfields came under attack. They noticed when familiar assumptions stopped working. And long after the shooting ended, many still remembered the commander responsible. Today, decades later, the Pacific War remains one of history's most studied conflicts. Battles, campaigns, and commanders continue attracting attention from historians around the world. Yet some of the most revealing judgments come not from supporters, but from former enemies. When Japanese commanders looked back at the war, they remembered many American leaders. They remembered industrial strength. They remembered naval power. They remembered overwhelming resources. But they also remembered a restless air commander who challenged conventional thinking and changed the way air warfare was fought in the Southwest Pacific. In the end, the reason Japanese commanders talked about George Kenney was surprisingly simple. He forced them to fight a war they had not expected. He attacked where doctrine said attacks were unlikely. He adapted faster than opponents anticipated. He transformed aircraft into tools of constant pressure. And by the time Japanese leaders fully understood what he was doing, the balance of power in the Pacific had already begun to shift. That is why his name survived in reports, interviews, and military history. Not because he followed the rules of air combat, but because he was willing to break them when breaking them offered a path to victory. And sometimes, the commanders remembered longest are not the ones who play the game better than everyone else. They are the ones who change the game itself.